The visual is not important here. The music is not important here. The voice is not important here. What matters are the words. If you cannot listen to the words, you do not belong here. If you understand this, welcome to the Fate Club. There comes a moment when identity no longer attaches itself to a function, when the internal system that once translated existence into tasks, goals, and roles begins to lose resolution, not through failure or collapse, but through a quiet withdrawal of relevance, as if the mind simply stops receiving updates from an operating system that once defined what it meant to be someone in the world. In this state, action still happens, movement still occurs, words are still spoken, and days still pass, yet something fundamental is absent, not in a dramatic or painful way, but in a manner so neutral that it often goes unnoticed at first, because the absence does not hurt, does not demand attention, and does not announce itself as a problem in need of solving. Previously, identity was maintained through alignment with tasks, through the constant internal question of what needs to be done next, who one must become in order to do it, and how performance will be evaluated once the action is complete. But when this structure loosens, the question does not get replaced by a better one. It simply dissolves, leaving behind a space where urgency used to live. This space does not immediately feel like freedom, nor does it feel like loss, because both of those interpretations belong to the same old framework that required identity to be measured against output, comparison, and progression. And without that framework active, interpretation itself becomes slower, less automatic, and less convincing. The body may still wake at the same hour, habits may remain intact, responsibilities may still be honored, yet internally, there is a growing sense that these actions are no longer assembling a self, no longer contributing to a narrative of becoming, and this is not experienced as resignation, but as a subtle decoupling between movement and meaning. In earlier stages, identity depended on friction, on resistance from a world, on problems that needed solving to justify one's position within it. But as friction decreases, not because the world improves, but because the nervous system stops amplifying it, the need for a task-based identity loses its anchor. This often produces a strange neutrality toward achievement, where outcomes arrive without producing elevation, and failures occur without producing collapse, not because one has mastered detachment, but because the internal structure that once translated outcomes into self-worth is no longer fully online. Without a task to perform, identity becomes harder to locate, and the instinctive response is to search for it where it used to be, in productivity, in goals, in future versions of oneself that promise coherence. Yet these searches increasingly return no signal, as if the environment no longer supports that frequency. What replaces this is not a new identity, but a prolonged interval where the system remains functional without a clear reference point, similar to how a device continues operating after losing connection to a central server, still running processes, still consuming energy, but no longer receiving instructions about purpose. During this interval, there is often a noticeable reduction in internal dialogue, not as silence, but as a lack of commentary about what actions mean, why they matter, or how they contribute to a larger story. And this absence is not filled with insight or revelation, only with presence that does not explain itself. Time behaves differently here, not accelerating or slowing in any measurable way, but losing its ability to pressure identity into motion, because without a task-oriented self, future projections lose their authority, and the present moment no longer functions as a stepping stone towards something else. This can appear externally as stagnation or withdrawal, yet internally it is experienced as a suspension of evaluation, where life is no longer constantly assessed for progress, alignment, or correctness, and instead unfolds with a kind of administrative indifference. Importantly, this state does not arise from a decision to stop striving, nor from a philosophy adopted to justify disengagement, but from a biological and cognitive recalibration in which the cost of maintaining a task-based identity exceeds its perceived benefit. The system does not rebel, it economizes, reducing unnecessary expenditure of attention on narratives that no longer yield adaptive value, and in doing so, it dismantles identity structures without hostility or intent. In this condition, questions about purpose feel strangely outdated, not because they have been answered, but because the internal environment that once generated them has changed, and asking them now produces little more than conceptual noise. Relationships may subtly reorganize around this shift, as interactions that relied on shared striving, comparison, or mutual reinforcement of roles begin to lose intensity, while quieter forms of presence require no explanation or performance to remain intact. There's no sense of arrival here, no plateau reached, no new status achieved, because the very framework that would recognize such milestones is inactive, and without it, experience becomes flatter, but also more stable. Identity without a task to perform does not disappear. It becomes diffuse, no longer localized in ambition, function, or future orientation, but spread thinly across perception itself, making it harder to point to, yet harder to threaten. This diffusion often brings with it a reduced susceptibility to external authority, not through resistance or skepticism, but through a lack of internal hooks, as commands, expectations, and incentives fail to attach themselves to a self that is no longer organized around compliance or reward. The absence of a task does not result in inactivity, but in activity without self-referential commentary, where actions occur because conditions support them, not because they reinforce identity, and this distinction, while subtle, fundamentally alters the internal experience of living. What was once a continuous effort to maintain coherence now feels unnecessary, and coherence itself becomes a byproduct rather than an objective, emerging spontaneously when conditions align, and dissolving just as easily without consequence. This is not a higher state, nor a lower one, but an adaptation, a response to an environment saturated with demands that no longer convert into meaning, prompting the system to downregulate identity production to preserve stability. In this adaptation, the self is no longer something that needs to be performed, defended, or optimized, but something that remains available without being foreground, like infrastructure that supports function without drawing attention to itself. Over time, the memory of constant striving may begin to feel abstract, as if recalling a former climate rather than a former self, and the urgency that once defined existence becomes difficult to reconstruct with emotional accuracy. Nothing in this process seeks validation, explanation, or resolution, because it is not oriented toward completion, only toward equilibrium, and any attempt to frame it as progress or decline reintroduces the very mechanisms that have already disengaged. What remains is not emptiness, but a kind of operational quiet, where life continues without demanding interpretation, and identity persists without needing a task to justify its presence. If you understand this, welcome to the club.